Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a collaboration I do every week with Michael K. Vaughan, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to discuss the comic books on which we have wasted our youths. It started out as a feature on Michael's channel, where he was going through his Epic Collection line, which is a full-color reprint line that Marvel does, that is not strictly chronological. It allows them to bounce around in their continuity to landmark events, to great runs, things like that, as opposed to just slogging through issue by issue. And we mostly deal with those epics. I've had emails from a number of you saying, boy, you should do every epic collection that comes out. Michael and I have read comics enough so that we probably would have a lot to say about literally every epic collection that comes out, but quite a few of them are bad. and also, because I horned in on his event, he does the picking. But we are this week preserving at least an element of the epic collection, because comics are not steady state. Landmark events can happen in them, and we're talking about one of those landmark events today. We're talking about Batman, A Death in the Family, which is a series of issues that took place in the Batman comic in the late 1980s. There you have a Mike Mignola cover, and you can see that Robin the Boy Wonder has seen better days. That's because in the course of this storyline, he is cornered by the Joker and the Joker's henchmen. He is elaborately, pornographically beaten to the doorstep of death by the Joker with a crowbar. And then he and his mother are blown up in a warehouse, and he dies. Robin dies. Now, I don't mean to go all mainstream media on. That's what the mainstream media said about this storyline, was that Robin dies. Actually, comic book fans know that this was Jason Todd. This wasn't the original Robin, Dick Grayson. This was Jason Todd, who was the second Robin, and who was played as a kind of counterculture, greaser punk, somebody who gives lip to Batman and who is insubordinate in the field and in the Batcave, all that sort of thing. Jason Todd was not tremendously popular with fans. I think a lot of fans at the time just wanted Dick Grayson to be Robin again, or if there's no Robin, to have Dick Grayson co-starring in at least one Batman title as Nightwing, the costume character that he becomes, just to preserve the team. That a lot of readers liked Batman as part of the team, but the copyrighted property of Batman and Robin is very old. By this point, it was 70 years old. So a Robin is kind of necessary for Batman. But the character of Jason Todd wasn't liked anymore by Denny O'Neil, the man in charge of this Batman line, than he was by most fans. And Denny O'Neil decided to weaponize that dislike by creating two phone numbers. This was in the days before the internet. He created two phone numbers that fans could call. One of them would constitute a vote for Robin to live in his confrontation with the Joker, and the other one would constitute a vote for him to die. And so the fans will decide. This is written by Jim Starlin. He doesn't draw it. The artwork is very phoned-in, third-rate work by Jim Aparo, who can do fantastic Batman artwork, but not in this. It's kind of ironic in a very unwelcome kind of way. The two of the landmark Batman storylines have Jim Aparo doing this washed-out, lazy work. He did A Death in the Family, and he also did the famous sequence where Bane breaks Batman's back. Both of those epic Batman story, pivotal moments in Batman history, are done by Jim Aparo, who is past his prime. So the artwork's not going to write home about here. It couldn't have been anyway. I'm pretty sure that Jim Aparo was not allowed to stray far from the script here. And the script is some fly-by-night story. It takes place in the Middle East. It doesn't take place in Gotham. Batman, Robin, and the Joker all fetch up in the Middle East. And fans voted. And DC Comics, Denny O'Neil, Jim Starlin, and the powers that be at DC Comics have forever since then maintained that the votes were that Robin should die. There is no verifiable proof that that is true. And the graphic novel of Batman: A Death in the Family has been in print nonstop since this came out in the late 1980s. Feel free to take out the back of an envelope and do a little rough calculation of how much money that means for DC Comics, as opposed to no graphic novel because Robin lives. You are well within your rights to believe that the fix was in, and that Tim Drake or Jason Todd was going to die anyway. But one way or another, Denny O'Neil and DC Comics made it public knowledge that the votes went against Robin, and so he dies. Batman comes upon his dead body in the rubble of the warehouse that was blown up, and that's that. And Batman becomes enraged with vengeance on the Joker. But there's a wrinkle. There's a little problem. In the meantime, the Joker has been drafted by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Those of you who were born in the 21st century will not know who that is. Those of you who know the 20th century will know perfectly well who that is. He's one of the major villains of the second half of the 20th century. He was the guy behind the destruction of the country of Iran, the handing over of the country of Iran into the hands of a cadre of religious nuts. Women have to wear sacks over their heads and can't go to school or have degrees or travel abroad. The great Satan, America, is suddenly the enemy. The Iranian hostage situation, all that is Ayatollah Khomeini. This is the Khomeini revolution. So it's the real world. It's not some made-up Arab country. It's the real world, and it's a real guy who runs that world. And he deputizes the Joker as an ambassador to the United Nations. There are actually panels that Jim Aparo drew here of the Joker with an Arab headdress on his green hair. So that when, at the end of this story, Batman corners the Joker, he is stopped from doing anything with the Joker by Superman, who says he has diplomatic immunity. Sorry, that's just the way it is. Well, what's that, you say? Jason Todd, your latest Robin, who I knew, was savagely murdered by the Joker. Well, it doesn't matter. He has diplomatic immunity. That characterization of a Superman who stops Batman from bringing the Joker to justice, having murdered Robin, that Superman is very familiar, was very familiar to people who read these issues as they were coming out, as I did, because that Superman is not known anywhere in the entire history of DC Comics except for one place, and that is Batman: Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. We've already covered on this channel. In Batman: Dark Knight Returns, Superman is a government lickspittle. He is a lapdog of the Reaganite government. He will do what they tell him. He's a good little boy. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. First of all, diplomatic immunity doesn't immunize you from murder, especially when you confess to it. And second, Superman also has diplomatic immunity. He has, at least in the standard continuity, he is a citizen of the world. He is a citizen. He has citizenship in every country. He is the UN special darling. And it wouldn't matter in either case. Superman would have simply helped Batman to put the Joker in jail. That's all there is to it. Since when do these characters act within the law? It's ridiculous. Instead, he doesn't. Because that's the Superman that was born in the pages of Batman: Dark Knight Returns. Is a government lickspittle. And so there isn't any resolution. The Joker, there's an explosion at the end and the Joker disappears. What should, that the very most have happened to Robin actually happens to the Joker. He has an ambiguous death where you know he's going to come back. But Robin certainly is not. Jason Todd, as Robin, is dead. Jason Todd does come back, but not as Robin. Batman moves on to another Robin. A few other Robins. It's disturbing. It's weird and disturbing. It lays bare the fact that if a man in a spandex bat costume leapt through a skylight into a room full of thugs with guns, he would instantly die. He would instantly die. The fall from the skylight alone would kill him, even if he weren't riddled with bullets. And if somehow that man did not get riddled with bullets and he brought a boy, a young teenager, in underwear and bare legs into that same conflict, they would both die instantly. They would both die instantly. If Batman wants to recruit a good soldier for his fight on crime, he would go to, the Gotham Parole Board and recruit an ex-Marine who's down on his luck and is an excellent fighter. Put him in a costume, and then, presto, you have an ally in your fight against crime. The fact that it's always a little boy, that struck fans of Batman and Robin as weird, even in the 1950s. To say nothing of the late 1940s, when often they would spot the bat signal, knowing that they were needed by Commissioner Gordon, while they were in bed. It was completely innocent, but there's no way for the 21st century to look at those panels where they're in their pajamas and they're sharing a bed. There's no way for the 21st century to look at those panels and think of them as innocent. They were innocent at the time. They were very much meant to be that way, but not any. There's no way to go back and look at that. This lays bare all of that. This could always have happened if you bring a boy into a relentless fight against violent crime. This could always have happened. The fact that it didn't ever happen is important. In the 1940s, Robin would often get beaten, struck on the head, clipped by a car. Batman would also often get beaten, struck on the head, shot even. And so the final panel of some of those old 40 comics of Batman and Robin would have one or both of them in the hospital. They'd have their masks on, but otherwise they'd just be in bandages. And you just assumed that they would recover and that they would go right back to it. They certainly weren't still recovering from those wounds in the next issue. Then something happened. Because, yes, Jim Starlin and Denny O'Neil perpetrated this atrocity on comics. The Joker beating Robin to death with a crowbar is not anything that should ever happen in comics. Ever. And the reason that it happened, yes, they are the two people who perpetrated this, but they aren't ultimately responsible. Someone else is ultimately responsible for the fact that we got the death by brutal torture of Robin the Boy Wonder. And that person, you guessed it, is Stan Lee, the impresario not of DC Comics, but of Marvel Comics, who introduced the idea that his comics take place more or less in the real world, where his characters need to worry about subway fare, and they have hang-ups, I believe was the term 50 years ago. I hated the people who used it, and I still do. In Stan Lee's world of comics, the Wasp, Janet Van Dyne, in an Avengers episode, could be hurt by a bullet and need to go to the hospital, need to be rushed to the hospital, and maybe not make it. You've all been to the hospital. You've read stories about people being shot, violent crime. It's not supposed to happen in comic books. Okay? It's not supposed to happen in comic books. Stan Lee introduced that. The virus of relevance. The virus of verisimilitude. That should never have been present. The virus of an interconnected world should never have been present. Of course, if there is a world in which the Joker beats Robin to death, that world cannot have Superman in it. Of course that is true. If you have an episode in which Superman has to deal with a massive tidal wave, that adventure has to take place in a world in which there is no Aquaman. Stan Lee changed all that. Suddenly the Manhattan that the Fantastic Four was in, they're just a few blocks from Bleecker Street, where Doctor Strange hangs his cloak when he's at home. And it caught on. The Stan Lee phenomenon in comics caught on. Fans loved it. And it made Marvel sell considerably better than DC Comics did. And people noticed that. The people at DC Comics noticed that. And started to want to make everything relative, to make everything real, put stakes in the game here. As if the Penguin threatening to release a cloud of poisoned pigeons on Gotham isn't stakes enough. And then you thwart him, and the final panel is him behind bars, vowing revenge. End scene. You have paid your 15 cents, and next month you will gladly pay your 15 cents to see what trouble Two-Face gets into. Instead of Two-Face or Penguin, or maybe both of them, becoming violent sadomasochistic lovers and also digging up the corpses of Bruce Wayne's dead parents in order to animate them with electronic bands around their heads so that they shamble at Bruce Wayne and try to kill him. Or in which a villain knocks Selina Kyle, Catwoman, unconscious, extracts her heart, and Batman finds her on a life support system with gigantic tubes coming out of her chest, and a note saying, "You'd better do what I say, or I'll throw her heart in the gutter." Yeah, that's just what I want to read in a comic book. Yeah, I definitely want to read a comic book in which the climax of the issue is that Bane casually snaps the neck of Alfred the Butler. And all of it, ultimately can be laid at the door of Stan Lee. If he were alive now, I'd slap him. Because this is what you get. This is what you get. Travesty like this is what you get if you introduce the Stan Lee virus into comic books. Now, some of you might say, some of you have heard this little geegaw before, and you might say, well, aren't there a whole bunch of comic book stories that you really love specifically because they work on the Stan Lee virus? Aren't you and Michael eventually going to talk about, for instance, the Dark Phoenix saga? Or Walt Simonson's run on Thor, or Frank Miller's run on Daredevil, and those would not be possible without the Stan Lee virus. And to you, I say, first, zip it, and second, I would be willing to lose those stories in order to lose these stories. In order to lose a story where the Thing's girlfriend gets raped by supervillains. In order to lose stories like that, I would lose the good ones. And that's a sacrifice I'd be willing to make not only for myself, but for you. I'd be willing for you to lose those stories too. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Superboy trying to figure out why this shady character in town is being so nice to Mr. Collins the chemist. Could it be that he's trying to dig a secret tunnel? Superboy might have to figure that out and then fix it. End scene. 12 cents, well spent, wait for next month. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There wasn't anything wrong with the comic book template that Stan Lee ruined in order to give us verisimilitude. There are no superheroes in the world. Who on earth wants verisimilitude when you can have a fun time instead? If you introduce verisimilitude, you absolutely have to introduce things like this. You absolutely have to have people tortured and murdered. Because that's what would happen. Not to Superman or to Wonder Woman, but to loser heroes like Batman who don't have any superpowers, that's what's going to happen. Sooner or later, that's what's going to happen. And nothing's going to be able to stop that. Unless you simply don't do it. So there you go. So my 2 cents worth on Death of the Family. I admit, there might be 1 or 2 elements of my reaction to this that are a bit predictable. But nevertheless, I would be the first in line to be praising this if it had been done well. I would have still given you my rant, absolutely. But I would be praising this if it had been done well, but it isn't done well. It's lazily written and horribly drawn. Whereas, let's come up with an example that I've mentioned on this channel before, an example that is pretty much the ultimate example of the Stan Lee virus in comics. Certainly the equivalent of this, only done beautifully, done perfectly, and that is, of course, the graphic novel, The Death of Captain Marvel. I wouldn't change a single word of that graphic novel. I wouldn't change a single panel. Now, some of you may be saying, I'm hearing a lot of your objections in my head. Some of you may be saying, well, you only like The Death of Captain Marvel because you never agreed with Captain Marvel being a character in the first place because your Captain Marvel is Billy Batson. No, and also zip it. No, The Death of Captain Marvel was the real world entering into a comic book scenario. In the case of that comic, it's not even something outlandish like the Joker. The Joker is not part of the real world, despite the efforts of the incel incitement movie to make an army of Jokers. The Joker is not part of the real world. But in The Death of Captain Marvel, he dies of cancer. You would think I would object to that even more, but it was beautifully done. The fact that Jim Starlin was involved in both is a mystery for the ages. But this, if you don't believe me, I guarantee you, your library will have a copy of the graphic novel collection of A Death in the Family. If you don't believe me and you've never encountered it, feel free to take it out of the library and read it yourself. It's dumb and bad. Sooner or later, I'm not blaming Michael for this. Sooner or later, he and I had to talk about this. We're eventually going to talk about every landmark in any kind of comic book, but this is not a good kind of landmark. So let's just leave it at that. So that's your Epic Comic Book Wednesday. A lot of you have been emailing me. A huge number of you have emailed me about the fact that Epic Comic Book Wednesday last week was a two-parter. Michael introduced the subject of comic books and movies, and then we agreed to do a follow-up discussion together in a Zoom call, comic books on TV, and a number of you have emailed me and said, could you please do a Zoom call every week on anything? You don't even have to talk about comics. Talk about anything book-related that you like. I love the idea. I want to point out that Michael, like the rest of you, has all kinds of obligations. He has, we don't know if he has a job. The stately Vaughan Manor is probably inherited, but he has to boss around all of the servants. And there's the lady of Vaughan Manor. I imagine she's fairly high maintenance, and he has those weird creatures that he calls dogs. He has responsibilities, in other words. So it's not always easy to get people with responsibilities to natter for 40 minutes on a Zoom call. Believe me, I know. I would like nothing better than to do a multi-part Zoom call or StreamYard or whatever for the hosts of Dick Timber, for the hosts of Autumn Moore, for the hosts of Book Trek. Good luck. Good luck getting any of that to happen. Every one of these events that I'm involved in, nobody is free to do multi-part conversations. And again, I hear you saying, is it possible that they are free, but they don't want to do it because they know you won't let them get a word in edgewise? And again, I say, zip it. What a contentious Comic Book Wednesday this has been. So we have death in the family. I will work on Michael to do another conversation. But in the meantime, here's hoping we go on to something a little bit nicer to talk about next week. I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.